Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here, and today I'm going to be coming at you with a video that's going to be addressing the Washington Wizards, their tumultuous season, and things that I think that they could do to improve their situation. So basically what I'm going to be talking about is 5 different trade proposals I've come up with that I think that the Washington Wizards could consider and that I think would improve their team or would just be a good shakeup because they're not necessarily going to improve their team with the sticky situation that they're in, but they could prevent themselves from getting worse. In that, if they keep everyone intact who they have now, they could be on a worse path than if they did some of the trades that I have come up with. So I have 5, and before I get into those though, I want to sort of just do a little recap of the Washington Wizards situation. So they have the second worst record in the Eastern Conference right now, about 3 weeks into the season. And really, nobody knows why. They have a lot of talent on paper. Last year, they didn't have John Wall for the whole stretch, but Otto Porter had his best season. He averaged around 15 points a game on 44% shooting from three-point land. Bradley Beal established himself as an all-star. John Wall obviously coming back as a perennial all-star, and Dwight Howard, despite being a little bit older, is still one of the better rebounders and defenders in the NBA. So you'd think with that and good supporting cast members in Markieff Morris and Jeff Green and Austin Rivers that they'd be okay, or at least a little bit better off the bench than they were before. But to no avail, they've been pretty bad. So a lot of people have been discussing the possibility of trading John Wall or Bradley Beal or Otto Porter or any combination of those players because they're all making the most money and they'd want to get them off the books, but they're also the most valuable guys in that they could get something of meaning, some meaningful return in exchange for them. So today I've developed some trade ideas for them, and let's get into them. So number 1 is regarding John Wall going to the Phoenix Suns, and here's the proposed trade. So John Wall to Phoenix in exchange for a first-round pick in next year's draft, T.J. Warren, Mikal Bridges, and Richaun Holmes. Now, the first-round pick is key to this because I don't think that the Wizards would be as inclined to do it without that, but the major haul they're getting as far as the best player in return would be T.J. Warren, who's good for roughly between 15 and 20 points a game, depending on the team he's on, but a pretty good third scoring option on a team. Mikal Bridges is a young, really promising player who could be a good 7th man off the bench for the Wizards. And then Richaun Holmes would just be a good backup center or power forward for the Wizards who can just provide you a solid 18 to 20 minutes a night off the bench, I think. So the Wizards are getting 75 cents on the dollar, I'd say, and that no one player that they're getting back is going to replace John Wall or eventually be better than John Wall. Mikal Bridges, he could develop into, I think, a Trevor Ariza, which would be a pretty good player. The draft pick would be, I think, the big incentive for the Wizards here, and that could be a top 5 pick for them. And you probably have Thomas Satoransky taking over the point guard duties from John Wall as a starter, with the starting lineup maintaining pretty much the same with Beal, Porter, Morris, and Dwight Howard, and then all of these 3 guys will be coming off the bench with basically T.J. Warren as your 6th man. And then for Phoenix, I actually think this is a great trade for them in that sort of what they're missing right now is a point guard, but if they acquired John Wall, their starting lineup would look something like John Wall, Devin Booker, Trevor Ariza, Ryan Anderson, and DeAndre Ayton, with the same sort of guys coming off the bench, and Jamal Crawford and a few other guys like Tyler Ulis and Dragan Bender. But I think that it's better. They have sort of a logjam at the small forward with Josh Jackson, Trevor Ariza, and T.J. Warren. And getting T.J. Warren and Mikal Bridges out of there frees up a little space on the wing and at the small forward. And then you fill a major hole at point guard where they were sort of playing Tyler Ulis there and they've been doing a little spot minutes of having Devin Booker just bring the ball up and not really having a point guard on the court. So I think John Wall to Phoenix would be a great trade for them. And although Washington isn't getting any amazing one player back, they are avoiding having to pay John Wall $35 million next year and at the end of his 5-year contract he's going to make $47 million. So they're avoiding that future hit on their salary cap. For trade scenario number 2, I have a trade that involves Bradley Beal being traded away from the Wizards. So Bradley Beal probably has the most value on the open market of any of the 3 players that I've been talking about for the Wizards. He can score 25, roughly 25, maybe 23 to 25 points a game. He has a really good 3-point shot. He can score in a number of ways. So he's probably the guy that's going to fetch the most as far as from a trade. So the trade I have here is to the Toronto Raptors. It's basically a trade that Toronto doesn't need, but I think would make them better in that they'd get a really solid second option for their team. So the trade goes as follows. Toronto gets Bradley Beal, Jordan McRae, and Troy Brown Jr. And Washington gets Norman Powell, OG Anunoby, Pascal Siakam, and Danny Green. So now you're saying, why would Toronto do this? They're giving up so much depth for just basically one guy, because McRae and Brown are just throw-ins for me. It's basically just for Bradley Beal. But because you can't really trade 4 for 1 as far as roster spots go, I had to throw in a few guys. But as we look here, none of these guys in between OG or Norman or Danny Green or Pascal, none of them are as good as Bradley Beal, but I think collectively they'd really improve the depth of Washington. You'd have a starting lineup looking like John Wall, Danny Green, Otto Porter, Markieff Morris, and Dwight Howard, with your bench being Satoransky, Rivers, OG, and Pascal, and that's a really good deep bench. And so I think that they wouldn't get better in a very obvious sense, but they get better in a subtle way that they just rise up and become more consistent instead of putting all their eggs in one basket, so to speak, with a star player like Beal, requiring him to score 25 points a game. They could just get 10 from Siakam, 10 from Anunoby, 10 from Danny Green, and that equates to more than the 25 that Beal can give you in a given game. And for Toronto, I almost think the opposite is true, in that they have so much depth that they need more of just a solid one concrete guy who can put the ball in the hole, and that would be Beal. They already have depth in Fred VanVleet, and they also have Darrell Wright at the guard spot as a backup that's pretty solid for them. As far as big men, they have Greg Monroe as a backup, and then they have Valanciunas and Ibaka, and at small forward, obviously, Kawhi. And so their starting lineup would look like this. It would look like Lowry at the point, Beal at the 2, Kawhi at the 3, at the 4, Ibaka at the 5, Valanciunas, and then coming off the bench you'd have Darrell Wright, Fred VanVleet, Greg Monroe, CJ Miles. Those would be your main guys off the bench. And I like this trade a lot for Toronto in that they just have so many guys on their roster. They have like about 11 guys that you could legitimately give 20 to 30 minutes a game to, and I think that this just clears the deck a little bit. Like a guy like Norman Powell is totally lost in the shuffle on Toronto just because there's so many guys that could play. And as far as OG, he's going to be either a backup to Kawhi or a little bit out of his element playing small ball, power forward. Pascal Siakam is, I'd say, basically the best haul from this trade for Washington. And so it's going to hurt to lose him a bit, but I'd say getting Bradley Beal is better than Siakam. So Toronto would be better off for this trade as well. And for that trade, the salaries are pretty even. They're just about even, just so you know. All right, moving on, I have another Bradley Beal trade. And this is to a team that I think desperately needs a shooting guard as well to really improve their roster. And that would be the Philadelphia 76ers. So the trade is Bradley Beal to Philadelphia, possibly throwing in some of those same guys that I had before, like McRae and Troy Brown. But you know, those are just throw-ins that don't really matter. You don't have to include those in the trade, but I'm going to throw them in just to make player exchange even, because I have Washington getting 4 guys back, so you can't do 4 for 1 really, so 4 for 3. Okay, so Philadelphia gets Beal and those 2 other guys that are irrelevant throw-ins. And then for Washington, back I have them getting back Zaire Smith, who was just recently drafted, a promising player who knows what will come from him. He was drafted, I think, 11th or 12th. Then I also have them getting Fultz, Covington, and Saric. Now, this may seem like a lot for Bradley Beal, but in my opinion, it's really not. And actually, now that I look at it, I think what I would do is take out Robert Covington and put in J.J. Redick instead. So Washington getting J.J. Redick, Fultz, Zaire Smith, and Dario Saric. They're getting a lot back, a lot of Philadelphia's main pieces, but none of those guys is better than Bradley Beal, and I'd say Bradley Beal is a significant step above all of those guys. So now looking at the roster for each team, you'd probably have Washington's starting lineup look like John Wall, J.J. Redick, Otto Porter, Markieff Morris, and Dwight Howard, with a bench of Austin Rivers, Jeff Green, as we already talked about, and then Markelle Fultz and Dario Saric as your main guys off the bench. Zaire Smith is sort of a throw-in at this point because he's not fully developed as a player, but he is promising for the future, so who knows what could come from him. But I like this trade a lot for both teams. They replace the spacing of Bradley Beal with J.J. Redick pretty adequately. They get a really promising young guy in Markelle Fultz, who has looked bad this season. I'll admit it, he's looked bad, but maybe just tinkering more with his game, he could improve. I don't know if he's a complete bust yet. I'm not willing to say that. He still has some promise in his game. And Dario Saric is a really solid sixth man who could do really well for this team. He can score in a number of ways, and he can space the floor, and he could be a small ball center, or you could play him alongside Dwight, or if you need to sub him in for Otto Porter, he could play at the 3. He can be a lot of things for a team. So again, Washington addresses a need that they've had for the past couple of seasons, which would be getting really good bench depth. And you have just a good, solid, basically 5-man rotation off the bench with Green, Rivers, Fultz, Saric. I guess that's 4 guys, but still, if you want to throw Zaire Smith in there, you can. So they got a really good, solid bench. And for Philadelphia, yes, they lose some depth, but they gain a player that's better than anyone they're giving up in Bradley Beal. Their starting lineup would probably look something like Ben Simmons, Bradley Beal, Robert Covington, maybe Amir Johnson at the 4, and then let's see here, Joel Embiid at the 5. You could also start Wilson Chandler at the power forward. Now that I think of it, that's probably what they'd do because he can space the floor more. He's traditionally a small forward, but in this league, small forward, power forward are kind of interchangeable. And then off the bench, you wouldn't have much. You'd have T.J. McConnell. You'd have this young guy that they got, the rookie named Shimei, and then you'd have Amir Johnson. So basically, honestly, a pretty weak bench, but I'd say, honestly, Bradley Beal is worth it. I think that, they were going to trade Robert Covington and Saric for DeMar DeRozan at one point, or they were going to trade those guys for Jimmy Butler. But, I think that Bradley Beal's pretty much on the same level as those guys, so I would do this trade if I were Philadelphia. You get immediately better with I'd say your second scoring option behind Embiid, and a guy who can space the floor, and he's going to be another passing target for Simmons and another distraction on offense. So I like the trade for Philadelphia. All right, moving on to my 4th trade, this one's kind of complicated and maybe one of the more far-fetched ones. This one and the next one are a little more far-fetched because they're a little bit of they're bigger trades, but here you go. The Minnesota Timberwolves and the Washington Wizards. 2 franchises that are a little bit troubled at this point, exchanging troubled stars. I have Washington getting Jimmy Butler, Jeff Teague, Gorgui Dieng, and Bates Diop, who is this really young guy who doesn't really play at all. He's just a throw-in and make salaries work. And then for Minnesota, I have them getting Otto Porter and John Wall. Now, I'm going to talk about this from Washington's perspective first. Their starting lineup would then look like Jeff Teague, Bradley Beal, Jimmy Butler, Markieff Morris, Dwight Howard, with a bench of Austin Rivers, Jeff Green, and Gorgui Dieng as their main guys off the bench, and Satoransky. That being said, they get some good depth in that they add Gorgui Dieng as a solid backup center or power forward off the bench, who they didn't really have another reliable big man. And for whatever you want to say, I think Gorgui Dieng is better than Ian Mahinmi. That's the really big hang-up, though, in this trade. I don't think that they would trade for Dieng just because they have Ian Mahinmi on the hook for the same amount of like $15 million. But also they get potentially, you could say, the best player in the trade back in Jimmy Butler. And he's better than John Wall, and I would say that Jeff Teague is about equal / slightly better than Otto Porter. So at the top of the trade, you're getting a little bit better value. You're also getting Otto Porter's roughly $30 million off the books, which he's definitely not worth. And you're also getting John Wall's $35 million next year, and eventually $47 million off the books for in the future. So for Washington, you can convince Jimmy Butler to stay possibly. You've got a good core with Bradley Beal and Jeff Teague, and then you've got Dwight Howard and Morris, and you've got the promising bench. So that could be potentially a good situation for Jimmy Butler if he wants to stay in the nation's capital. That's a contender that he would probably be satisfied with going to. And then as far as Minnesota goes, their starting lineup after this trade would likely look like John Wall starting at the 1, Andrew Wiggins at the 2, Otto Porter at the 3, Gibson at the 4, Towns at the 5, and then their bench would look something like how it already looks right now, like Derrick Rose, Josh Okogie. The big man spot would be a little bit troublesome. They'd probably put in Tolliver would be their main power forward off the bench, but they wouldn't really have a backup center. They might have to play Taj Gibson as small ball center, but that would be okay, I think. But yeah, I think that Minnesota gets better in a way in that basically they get Jimmy Butler out of there, which he's just causing problems, and they get a pretty comparably like a guy that's of pretty comparable talent, but in a different way in John Wall. He's a good ball distributor. He's a pretty decent defender for his position. I like that for them. Otto Porter's a guy that shoots really well from 3. For his career, he's over 40%. This year, he's shooting 37, which isn't as good, but last year, I think he was like either first or second in the league at 44% from 3, and then the year before, he was 43%. And that's something that Minnesota really needs is a 3-point shooting and spacing. So I like that aspect of this trade a lot for Minnesota. Now, it's not great in that these guys have huge contracts, but they are also getting rid of Jeff Teague and Gorgui Dieng, who had really big contracts for the players that they were, and Jimmy Butler, who's making 20. So I think it evens out, and that the salaries that are being exchanged are pretty equal and fair. And besides, Jimmy was going to want a max contract if he stayed in Minnesota anyways, so you're basically maintaining about the same level of salary, just getting a guy that people don't like out of there in Jimmy Butler, and getting some kind of larger scale salaries out of there in Jeff Teague and Gorgui Dieng. But again, it's kind of canceling out because Otto Porter makes more than he should as well. But yeah, I think that this trade benefits both teams in that you're essentially getting equal value, I'd say. But you're just replacing the guys that are kind of problem childs with given players on their team. You're transplanting them onto other teams. I think that Wall would do well in Minnesota, and that the guys that are on the team really like to score, and he really likes to distribute. So I think that would be good. He's a much better ball distributor than Jeff Green is. So I think that it wouldn't be a problem for Minnesota bringing him in, even though he doesn't shoot it very well. He probably around a 30% shooter from 3. So that being said, I like this trade for both teams. All right, moving on to the last one I have here of the 5. This is the really big one that's going to take a little bit of time to explain, so just bear with me here. So it's a 4-team trade, and this one's probably the least likely because it would be the most complicated, but I have the Washington trading away each of their 3 big players, John Wall, Bradley Beal, and Otto Porter. And so I have John Wall going to the Orlando Magic. And if you don't know, Orlando is desperately in need of a point guard. They have DJ Augustin as their starting point guard, who is an okay player. He's around 31 years old, and he's been a perennial backup. So it proves to their lack of depth at the position that they're starting him. His best season, he averaged around 13 points a game, and that was like a 1 year like amazing season for him. He's really good for about 9 points and 4 assists a game. So as you can see, about 18 minutes a game maybe. So they get John Wall in there, and I have them trading away Aaron Gordon for him. Aaron Gordon's a really promising young player. Honestly, right now he's making about the same as Wall. Wall's going to make more in the upcoming seasons, but right now they're both making around $20 million. So equal contract value. And Washington gets a really young, really good, promising player in Aaron Gordon, who I think just needs a place where he can thrive and kind of be more of the main guy, whereas I feel like in Orlando, they sort of said he was the main guy, but for a time there was Victor Oladipo there, and he kind of thought he was the main guy. And even now they send mixed messages in that they just drafted another big guy in Mo Bamba, and they already had Vucevic, and so it's a really crowded front court. So Orlando does a good job in clearing up their front court a bit, and Washington does good in getting a pretty valuable player in exchange for Wall. So Orlando's starting lineup quick after this trade would look like John Wall, Evan Fournier, Jonathan Isaac, and then probably starting Vucevic and Bamba together. I would think that's what I would do. It's 2 centers, so that doesn't help in spacing a ton, but Vucevic can shoot some threes, so their spacing wouldn't be terrible, but that's just what I'd do. I like the idea of starting 2 7-footers in this league where people are trying to play like 6'7" guys at center. I think that you would be a really defensive, good defensive team. And also you'd have Mo Bamba getting more of a chance to flourish. If you traded away Gordon, you'd free up space in the front court for him. Okay. So I'm not going to go over the Washington Wizards outlook until the end of this, just because if I go over their lineup for each trade, it's going to change each time. So that being said, the next guy I have going is Otto Porter to New Orleans. This is potentially the hardest sell, but this is just my hypothetical. So here you go. So Otto Porter to New Orleans for Solomon Hill and E'Twaun Moore. So for New Orleans, you get a guy that spaces the floor really well, which you want with Anthony Davis on the floor to clear up space for him in the middle to do his interior work and shoot from the mid-range a little bit. So Otto Porter frees up some space in the interior for Anthony Davis to work. Also, Jrue Holiday loves to slash when he is on offense. He loves to get to the rim and drive on guys. And he does a little bit of floater and mid-range game as well, so that clears up space for Jrue Holiday down low if you have Otto Porter on the wing. And Solomon Hill is not as good of a shooter as Otto Porter, so defenders can sag off of Solomon Hill more on the three-point line, but they really can't sag off of Otto Porter, so you're stretching defenses more getting Otto Porter in there. And then along with Solomon Hill going to Washington, I also have E'Twaun Moore. E'Twaun Moore is not as good as Otto Porter, but he is like the main haul from this trade. He's a pretty serviceable like 6th to 7th man, I'd say. So that's where I would have him for Washington maybe. Or I guess considering Bradley Beal is going to be gone from another trade I'm doing here, he might start for this team. Okay, so Washington benefits from this trade in that they're going to have Solomon Hill's $12 million off the books after this season, and E'Twaun Moore is making a pretty reasonable $9 million. For New Orleans, they get a lot better spacing. Their lineup after this might look something like Elfrid Payton, Jrue Holiday, Otto Porter, Nikola Mirotic, and Anthony Davis with Julius Randle off the bench. And obviously I'll go over Washington's lineup at the end. And then the last trade I have here would be Bradley Beal going to the Milwaukee Bucks in exchange for Eric Bledsoe and Tony Snell. This trade I think makes a ton of sense for both teams. I like the spacing that Bradley Beal brings. I think he's a better shooter than Eric Bledsoe, and he's obviously a better player than Tony Snell, so I really like him for Milwaukee. They have Chris Middleton, who's a decent second option, but I think Bradley Beal would be a better, like, bona fide second option for the team. Like a guy that you can rely on 23 to 25 points a night. Chris Middleton is an amazing third option for a team, and you really don't lose much as far as depth because they have a plethora of wing guys, so losing Tony Snell doesn't hurt. And as far as Eric Bledsoe, he's making $15 million a year, and he's on an expiring contract, so you're going to get that money that money's gone. Actually, the money in this trade is just about equal. For Snell and Bledsoe are making 25 combined, and Beal's making 25, so the money's equal. But Eric Bledsoe isn't as good as Bradley Beal, and so I think Milwaukee's getting the better end of this trade. But Washington's getting a really respectable starting point guard in Eric Bledsoe, like right below all-star caliber, or at least he was in Phoenix. He's not really much anymore. He's deteriorated a little bit, but he's still a really respectable point guard. And Tony Snell's a really long, good wing defender. So you're getting a little bit more depth on your wing. And for Milwaukee, you can start Malcolm Brogdon at the point guard because he is a point guard. He's a combo guard, so he can do either. So Milwaukee's lineup would look like Malcolm Brogdon, Bradley Beal, Chris Middleton, Giannis, and then Brook Lopez at the center. And off the bench, you wouldn't miss anything with Tony Snell. You'd still have like Dellavedova, Dante DiVincenzo, Ersan Ilyasova, John Henson, Thon Maker, plenty of guys off the bench. But yeah, the starting lineup would be Brogdon, Beal, Antetokounmpo, Middleton, and Brook Lopez. Now for the Washington Wizards, let me sort through all the guys that they got and sort of what it all means. So the benefits for Washington are that they get a really good young promising guy in Aaron Gordon back for only $20 million. They get Eric Bledsoe, who if he plays well, they can re-sign him. If he doesn't play well, it's the last year of his contract, so that would free up $15 million for them. They're getting back Solomon Hill, who's on expiring money as well, for $12 million. And then they're also getting not throw-ins, but kind of lower level guards in E'Twaun Moore for $9 million and Tony Snell for $10 million. So the primary reason that they do this trade is just to clear the deck. By doing these trades, they'd effectively get rid of roughly, next year, they'll have gotten rid of about, let's see here, $90 million in cap space between Beal, Wall, and Porter, because next year I think Porter makes 30, and Wall's going to make 35, and Beal's making 25, so that adds up to 90. And after next year, if they don't re-sign Bledsoe or Solomon Hill, they would only have from the trades with these three guys roughly $40 million. So that's saving $50 million in cap space if they were to do this deal, which could translate to like 3 to 4 possibly really quality players, or like a max contract to bring in a Durant to his home city. And you could even bring in a second guy. You could bring in a Durant and a Jimmy Butler. You could bring in a Durant and a Kyrie. You could do a lot of different stuff. And then they would still have a promising court around them in that they'd still have guys like Aaron Gordon, Dwight Howard, and Markieff Morris. But just for this trade itself, looking at what the starting lineup would be after the trade, Washington would start probably Eric Bledsoe at the 1. I would guess E'Twaun Moore at the 2. And then probably Aaron Gordon at the 3, Markieff Morris at the 4, Dwight Howard at the 5. And then off the bench, your main bench guys would be same guys as before for the most part in Jeff Green, Austin Rivers, Thomas Satoransky. But then you'd add Tony Snell as another presence off the bench. So in the immediate future, I'd say that Washington gets worse with this trade. But after this season, when they are saving $50 million in cap space, they're getting immensely better. So guys, with all these trades, I would like you to let me know what you think in the comments. You might really agree or disagree with what I've said about these players. You might think, don't get rid of John Wall. He's a top 3 point guard in the league. And in that case, let me know. Or you might think Bradley Beal is the best young shooting guard in the league. And let me know that too. Or if you agree with what I say or have a variant of a trade that I've set up, let me know. Or your own trade scenarios that you have come up with. Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope you have a good day. Bye.